Welcome back, book warriors. Kwe tansei seigo anibuju. Welcome to my YouTube channel where we focus on educating the resistance and inspiring the next generation of warriors to help us protect our people and the planet. This video is the fourth in my new Reconciliation Book Club series, where we help feature Indigenous authors and allies who are writing about important and current Indigenous issues. And the reason why we're doing that is because we want real substantive reconciliation, where we talk about education not just for the sake of it, not for entertainment, not for casual purposes, but it's education for action. We want everyone, Indigenous and our settler allies alike, to work together to help finally bring justice to Turtle Island. So today I'm going to be reviewing the late Arthur Manuel's book, Unsettling Canada, A National Wake-Up Call. And it's a real honor for me to be reviewing this book because Arthur Manuel was a well-known Native leader and also a Native rights activist. And he never gave in, he never settled, he never compromised his values. He was always in defense of our lands, our self-determination, and our core identity. You don't want to miss this review, so stay tuned. Welcome back, Reconciliation Book Club members. Thank you so much for sticking with this club. It really means a lot to me. And I've been getting tons of messages from people all over my different social media. And some of the most exciting ones are from universities and libraries and individuals who are hosting their own reconciliation book clubs that are following along with these videos, reading the same books and having discussions, watching these videos, and really getting into the root of the matter. And some of them are even figuring out ways in which they can move social justice forward for Indigenous peoples. And that's exactly what I hoped would come out of this Reconciliation Book Club. So thank you so much. And for all of you who, are really busy with life, I mean, you have kids, you have work, you have outside activities, you may be donating a lot of your time to your community, and you might feel like you just can't keep up with this Reconciliation Book Club. Don't worry, this book club is also for you because you don't have to be anywhere at any specific time. You can read these books at your own pace because one of the great things about YouTube is that these videos are always here. You could watch them a month from now, you could watch them 6 months from now. So everyone can literally participate at their own pace, in their own time, and when it's good for them. So today I'm going to be reviewing Arthur Manuel's book, Unsettling Canada, A National Wake-Up Call, and it was published by Between the Lines. Now here's the interesting thing. When I first started this Reconciliation Book Club, I sent a call out for book suggestions from people about the books you wanted me to review, and Arthur Manuel's Unsettling Canada was by far the most requested book for me to review. Arthur Manuel's book, Unsettling Canada, was published by Between the Lines in 2015. Now, the publishing company Between the Lines describes itself as engaging in radical book publishing, and they've been doing this since 1977. Between the Lines describes itself as wanting to publish high-quality books that help promote social justice and social change. They publish authors that give their insight, their experience, and their analysis on things like law, policy, politics, social issues, and many of which it's the kind of analysis that you wouldn't find in the mainstream. And you might notice a theme in this book club. I tend to pick both authors and publishing companies where possible that focus on social justice, that focus on lifting up and empowering the voices of those who wouldn't necessarily be published in the mainstream, because that's where you really get to the social justice issues, especially on Indigenous issues. The book is about 266 pages, it's a paperback, it's available from Between the Lines directly, or you can order it from online companies like Amazon.ca, for example, and the book runs about $29.95. It's also available in various e-formats, ranging generally from around $10 and under. Arthur was born to his mom, Marceline, and his dad, George, both of whom were from native territories in BC, and Arthur grew up on the Nisconluth Reserve. Arthur came from a very political family. I mean, most people who are involved in Native politics are very familiar with his father, George Manuel. He's known all over. He has his own writings. He was a very, very persistent and powerful Native rights activist, and he was also one of the very first leaders of the National Indian Brotherhood, which later became the Assembly of First Nations. And clearly, George's son Arthur followed in his political footsteps, because Arthur served 4 elected terms as chief of his Nisconluth First Nation. And he also served 6 years as the chair of the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council. And political activism also runs strong in Arthur's family, not just from his dad, but also his own children, who are also very politically active, especially on the ground. Some of you might remember the book that I featured a couple of book reviews ago called Whose Land Is It Anyway?, where we featured Arthur Manuel, which is the daughter of Arthur Manuel, and she has just been recently arrested by police for peacefully trying to defend her territory from pipelines, and they even broke her arm. So you've got a family that is always been willing to put their life, their liberty, their freedom, their name, and everything that means everything to them in defense of their lands and their territories, their peoples, and their self-determination. To say that the Manuel family is a powerful one would be a real understatement. I mean, the Manuel family has an unwavering commitment to defending native lands and waters and peoples and self-determination, and we have all benefited from their advocacy. Now, Arthur also has another published work. It's called The Reconciliation Manifesto, and it is definitely a book that we'll be reviewing in this book club at some time in the future. What I'll do is I'll post a link in the description box below this video so that you can have access to his previous publications, and also post a link to our previous book review on Whose Land Is It Anyway?, which was done in his honor and featured some of his writing. The book is 266 pages, and it's divided into about 17 different chapters, and it has a foreword by Naomi Klein, who herself is a New York Times best-selling author. She's a journalist, she's an activist, and really well known, especially in the environmental community, where she's trying to protect the planet from ongoing climate change. The book also contains an afterword by Ronald Derrickson, who was given the honorary title of Grand Chief, but we'll talk more about that after. Several prominent Indigenous activists and academics have also come out and offered their words of praise for this book. I mean, you've got Glenn Coulthard, Leanne Simpson, Drew Hayden Taylor, and many others, and you can find them on the inside and on the back cover of the book. This book, which is a national bestseller, is categorized in the History and Indigenous Studies category, and it also won the Canadian Aboriginal History Award, which is just amazing. So you know that this book packs a real punch. It's a unique book that combines politics and history, resistance, social movements, and a real insight into Native activism in a first-person perspective, one that's based on lived experience, and it's really honest, open, and frank. Now, each chapter covers both a different issue and a different time period, and at times it reads like you're really right there as it's unfolding. Whether it's the release of the 1969 White Paper on Indian Policy, the Constitution Express, or the protests that were held at Sun Peaks, it is an incredible lived insight. Arthur also provides a really good analysis of key junctures in time, like when the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was released, when the Delgamuukw decision came down from the Supreme Court of Canada, which was the first major decision on Aboriginal title, and he really offers a lot of insight in that regard. And so if you're one of those people who are new to this book club or new to Indigenous histories and in current political Indigenous issues, this is a great book for you, because even though you don't have the background on it, you'll learn a lot from a first-hand perspective as Arthur was going through it. And for those of you, Native studies and political science junkies who've been working in this for years, you'll also get a lot out of this book because of his lived personal insight, and that is invaluable. And you won't find that in any history books. Even where they do mention all of these historical issues, they don't talk about it from how did we organize, what was going on behind the scenes, what were the real challenges, how should we do things differently in the future. And that's why this book is so useful, because he also incorporates his thoughts and ideas on what we can do to advance our rights on an ongoing basis. Now, the core thesis of this book is that the root cause, the primary root cause of all of the socio-economic conditions of First Nations in this country stems from the dispossession of our lands and resources. And that is the number one underlying factor. And it's also the number one reason why we continue, many of us, to live in poverty. It's because our lands continue to be held from us and our resources continue to be held from us. And he makes the point that we heard him say all over the country many times, that it is impossible for sovereign, self-determining Indigenous nations to sustain themselves, their governments, and their peoples when they only have 0.2% of all of the traditional lands that they used to have in Canada. And so on a go-forward basis, land is key. Now, he points out the fact that it's true that the federal government is engaged with organizations like the Assembly of First Nations, and it's always a back and forth on federal programs and services. And while those federal programs and services are very much needed because of the impoverished, socio-economic conditions caused by the land dispossession, that what they do is they keep us constantly chasing federal programs and services, trying to deal with the aftermath of what is land dispossession and taking the wealth away from our nations. So he says that just keeps us in dependency and doesn't address the issue of they need to return our land and resources back. Now, his solution going forward is no surprise. It's also a recognition by the Canadian state that we have Aboriginal title, that we are self-determining peoples, and to engage in processes where a return of some of those lands and resources are made, and also that our self-determination is incorporated within the law. Now, he recognizes that any solutions which are based in part on recognition of our rights within Canadian law is inherently problematic. But what he's saying is that because Canada's Constitution, which is Canada's supreme law for Canadians, where it contains all of the division of powers and different jurisdictions, because that document is so powerful and it's the governing document over the state of Canada, that including statements and laws and protections related to the protection of our Aboriginal title and the protection of our right to be self-determining, he thinks that in the end that would still be more beneficial and a bigger form of true reconciliation, a substantive reconciliation, and would act really as a shield against Canada going outside of or breaching our rights to self-determination and an Aboriginal title. And when you think about it, in the Canadian legal system, and I'm not talking about the Indigenous legal system, which has never been displaced, but in the Canadian legal system, Canada's Constitution they consider that to be the supreme law of their legal system, in the sense that it trumps all other laws, and other laws can't be amending the Constitution without going through a constitutional amendment process. So because that law is so powerful, and because our treaties are already incorporated in there, and the Royal Proclamation is included in there, that he's thinking that that is one of the ways forward to guaranteeing our rights within this Canadian system. The other part I really liked about this book is his honesty about all of the challenges associated with the Native struggle. But at the same time, he acknowledges that it's actually a privilege that we have to be here, to be engaged in this Native struggle, and to be a part of our nationhood and our sovereignty in defending our territories. And he actually makes a quote from his dad, George Manuel. And George says, "The most important gift we have received from our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents is the legacy of struggle." And I think that's a very powerful sentiment to remind us to put this struggle in context, that even though it's difficult, we're very lucky to be here and to have inherited this passion and commitment and sovereignty and sense of identity from our ancestors. At the same time, he's also very frank about the political failures of the Assembly of First Nations, especially in recent years, and how the Assembly of First Nations, or the AFN, has actually become an incredible barrier, a challenge, and an impediment to us in the cause. To his mind, the AFN has had a detrimental impact on the Native rights movement, and that's one of the issues that we have to deal with going forward. Now, in terms of a critique of this book, I always struggle to find something to say, because in any book review, you're supposed to celebrate its highlights and find things that could be improved. Now, one of the things I found was that because I'm a lawyer and because I'm an academic, I'm inherently obsessed with citations. And the reason why I like citations is because I like to use all of these books as resources for ongoing research, publications, reading other materials that I might not have read, and he refers to a lot of documents and materials in this book, and they're not all cited. So I guess if I had to find a critique, that would be one of them, but that's only from an academic perspective. That's probably not something that the general public cares as much about. Now, the other issue is the Afterword by Grand Chief Ronald Derrickson. I understand he was really close friends with Arthur and helped fund many of his international activities and his advocacy, his book writing and things like that. And, you know, that's something really to be acknowledged, because anyone who is able to support Arthur Manuel should be acknowledged, because Arthur Manuel did such important work. And as we all know, being an activist, being an advocate, you don't get rich from that, and you certainly don't have access to the same amount of funds as large corporations do or governments do. So I think that's a significant contribution. The only small issue I have is that his chapter doesn't really read the same way as the rest of the messages in Arthur Manuel's book. He seems to focus more on resource extraction, which seems at times to be in conflict with what Arthur Manuel was doing. I mean, there was lots of content in his book where he was trying to stop resource extraction from Native territories. So if I had to find a critique, that would probably be one of them. But overall, this is an incredibly strong book. I mean, all of it taken together is one that everybody in this country should read. Everybody should understand what actually happened behind all of these events that occurred over all of these time periods. I've actually had to read this book several times, because when the book first came out, I was asked to do a book review of it for the Literary Review of Canada. And even though I've read this book multiple times, I always come to the same conclusion. This book really, really inspires me. Even though there's aspects in the book that are so disheartening and frustrating and even heartbreaking, that we are engaged in the exact same struggle decade after decade, generation after generation, it also inspires me because it talks to the resilience and the strength and the hope and the pride of our people and their absolute commitment to always maintaining the integrity of our territories and our sovereignty and jurisdiction. And that's a really inspiring message for me. So in the review that I did for the Literary Review of Canada, I came to the following conclusion, and I'm just going to quote from it. Both young activists and seasoned warriors will all gain invaluable insight into the conditions that led to critical mistakes and to political success. It is a rare opportunity to gain from the knowledge, experience, and mistakes of a respected activist and leader who is still engaged in the struggle. As an activist myself, I felt a whole range of emotions reading his accounts of various protests. At times, I was sad for the suffering of his family, angry about the government tactics used to vilify and divide us, and frustrated that little seems to have changed. At the same time, I was inspired by the stories of grassroots people who have always been the real source of power behind our movements. Many young Indigenous activists will likely feel a source of pride knowing that Indigenous peoples have always resisted and have never given up despite all that has been done to them. This is an important part of ensuring a positive legacy for the next generation of activists in a context of oppressive, assimilatory influences. This book really spoke to me. It hits me in the heart every time I read it. It really speaks to our collective struggle from an activist point of view. Arthur had a unique way of sharing the good, the bad, the frustrating, and the inspiring. And just like the last couple of books that we reviewed for this Reconciliation Book Club, I really appreciate books that are for the purposes of education and action. Arthur makes a strong call to continue the struggle and never settle for less. Arthur's advocacy at the international level was pivotal to advancing our rights, both at a domestic level and at the international level. And I had the honor and the privilege to work with him from time to time at the United Nations, in Geneva or in other places, and learn from him, watch him in action, and really try to understand the best way to advocate for our people at the international level. His passing was a huge loss, not only to his family and his community and his territory, but to all of the other Native people all over Turtle Island and indeed around the world who have benefited from his advocacy and from his interventions, not just here in Canada, but also at the international level. I mean, he was very prolific at the international level, and he coordinated and worked with lots of other Indigenous groups from around the world. And I'm just really thankful that we have some resources from him, that we have books that we can read, that we have videos, we have submissions that he made at the international level. And I think we really need to take stock of that and see the value in that for our advocacy moving forward. And Arthur also left some very important messages for settler allies as well. He said and acknowledged that settler allies have been very important all along the way in his advocacy in all different forums. And he also says that the advocacy and action of settler allies are going to be key in the future to finally realizing justice on Turtle Island for Indigenous peoples. So that means he's talking to you. He's talking to all of our Native warriors out there, and he's talking to all of you settler allies, that you are the key to realizing justice on Turtle Island. And we need you not just to be engaged in a process of education for reconciliation, but also education for action, education for justice, so that we all have a future. So let's move on to some comments and impressions. And thank you again for everybody participating, for sending me their questions and comments on a whole bunch of different social media forums, and also for those who engage in conversation in this YouTube forum because I think it's really helpful. When you leave questions and comments and impressions in the comment section below the videos, it really helps other people because they get to benefit from what's being said. And so the more we can continue to do that underneath the videos in the comment section, I think that it'll just continue to enrich this Reconciliation Book Club. So let's start with Cluster Together. Here's what they say. Thanks for another great book and video. As you mentioned, this is a very important book for Canadians to read. Europeans often center their historical narratives around who won what battle. I have never enjoyed this kind of framing of history, but in this case, because this book is centered around the resistance to colonial military force, it is interesting and very useful, especially as it educates us about what really happened when Europeans arrived and started pursuing their goals of land accumulation and economic domination. Thank you, Cluster Together, for leaving your feedback. And for the rest of you Reconciliation Book Club members, make sure to check out the comments because Cluster Together didn't just leave this comment. They actually went through and made comments on some of the different chapters. So there's a lot to be learned and a lot of valuable insight there. Thanks again. Now let's turn to Valerie Peters. Here's what she had to say. I think Mr. Manuel, Unsettling Canada, must write in a style that I like to read, as I raced through his book as though it were a thriller or adventure novel. I found his style made the narrative real, vital, and put me right in the middle of the action. I literally could not put down the book. The only difficulty I had was near the end of the book. I got a bit lost in all of the acronyms. It was hard to keep the alphabet soup sorted out to figure who was on whose side. Thank you, Pam, for recommending this excellent book. Thank you for those kind words, support, staying in the club, and for your valuable feedback, Valerie. Everybody's going to benefit from it, and I can't agree with you enough. I was also enthralled by this book. I really liked the storytelling nature of this book, really hearing about these things from his perspective. And I acknowledge what you're saying about acronyms. Acronyms are very difficult, and especially in a Native political context, there are so many organizations, so many reports that we end up using so many acronyms that even if we spell it out, by the end, we're using so many it can be confusing, especially for people who don't work in that area. So that's a really good point. And finally, Susan Callis has this to say. I am quite late commenting on this book, but I did find it wonderfully straightforward, and I'm seeing the benefit from connecting with such great resources and books. As a college educator teaching on the history of social work and social service work, I am sharing these resources with students, and they are using it to engage and learn about what was omitted from our lessons previously. This is fantastic news, Susan. Thank you. This is exactly what I wanted the book club to do. I want this book club to be a resource, and to hear that you're actually including these resources in courses where they might not have been included before, that makes a huge difference. That's how we change education in Canada, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for all Canadians, because Canadians also need to unlearn and decolonize what they were taught in school. So thank you. That's a huge bonus to this book club. Thank you so much for joining me for yet another Reconciliation Book Club video. I hope you all enjoy it. I hope you're all enjoying your own individual and collective reconciliation book clubs. I hope you're learning a lot from this, and please keep sending me all of your questions and your comments and your book suggestions. For those of you looking for more resources outside of this Reconciliation Book Club, please check out my website. It's www.pampalmater.com, where I include both a list of my own publications, but also a list of resources, really important reports, inquiries, and commissions that I think all Canadians need to read to have a true understanding of what's happening for Native people in this country. From my my website, you can also access my podcast. It's called Warrior Life, and that's where I interview a whole bunch of on-the-ground warriors who are defending our Indigenous nations in a whole bunch of different ways. From on-the-ground warriors like Arthur Manuel to warriors who are defending First Nation kids in foster care like Cindy Blackstock, and many, many, many others. And some of them are also authors that I have already featured or will be featuring in the future in this book club. So there's a lot to be learned from those podcasts. You can also check out the rest of the videos on my YouTube channel, where I talk about difficult legal and political issues. I provide overviews of important reports and inquiries like the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, and also a review of prominent court cases or issues that are in the media. So be sure to subscribe to this book club, hit the notification button so that you know every time a video is released. So, what is the next book, you ask? Well, here it is. It's by Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, and it's called The Story of a National Crime. It's a very, very small book. It's free. I will post a link to a downloadable PDF in the description box. It won't take you even an hour to read it. And our next meeting of the Reconciliation Book Club will be on Sunday, December 15th, and that'll be the last one for 2019. So we're rounding it out with a book that's easily accessible, doesn't cost any money, and you'll be able to read it in less than an hour. Thank you so much for participating in this book club, and don't forget to leave me your comments for this book under this video so that I can incorporate them into the next review. Stay alert, warriors.